Welcome to another episode of Artist Spotlight, the podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Stringer, and joining me is photographer Michelle Guillermin, who I'm thrilled to have with us. We've known each other for a while. We met during kind of the middle of COVID through social media, and she was just a tremendous resource for me, specifically to find out where I could get COVID testing. So we're going to catch up with her about all of her travels and her wildlife photography that I know is her passion. I also want to remind everybody that the podcast is brought to you by your friends at the Maryland Photography Alliance, where there's always new information being updated every week about contests, events, photography events. And I also encourage people to find out, if you're Maryland based, which of the 27 camera clubs in the state are near you. So much good information available, so many photo walks, so many like-minded people to get together with and form friendships, learn, and increase your knowledge of a hobby and an interest that we all really have known to love. You can check out what is going on at mdphotoalliance.org for more information. And with that, and with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Michelle Guillermin to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, likewise. So we met a few years ago, and I've got met in air quotes with through social media, and you had helped me find the COVID testing site. So I know what it was like for me, but what was it like for you traveling around the world during the middle of everything that we all made it through, thankfully, or most of us made it through?
Well, I have to admit, I didn't do nearly as much travel as, looking back, I should have, because when I did get to Kenya during COVID, it was a remarkably different place than I usually go to. And what I really was surprised to see is how differently the animals behaved when there weren't a mass of people around them. They were very relaxed. They were very apt to approach you very closely, and they were a lot more curious than they might normally be.
Yeah, and I know when we talked by phone the other day, I mentioned that I had been in Tanzania during the birthing season, migration season, and I had a very similar experience. It was a good and a bad, because you had really the almost like the Masai Mara to yourself, but you didn't have the ability for your guide to be in regular communication with other guides where you could share information, share sightings. You were kind of on your own. So a lot of benefits to that. But then, there were some negatives, because you didn't have the benefit of that intel to find out where the wildlife was. So, a lot of people start photography just from a general perspective, whether it's friends or family or events. What was it that got you to pick up a camera? I use the term with intention. Sometimes it's, here's a point and shoot, or back in the day, even more so, here's a disposable camera. What got you started early on with a camera?
I was one of those that always had a camera and kind of took fun pictures because it was fun. And then I decided to take a leave of absence from my job and buy a round the world ticket and travel around the world. And I was so poor at that point. This was not a fancy trip, that I moved out of my apartment. I lived in a friend's extra bedroom. And with the rent savings that I had, I bought a camera and a long lens that I could take with me on this year-long trek. So it really was travel that instigated it for me.
I heard somebody say this once, and it's so opposed to what you just said. The comment was, I heard a couple saying, why would anybody buy a plane ticket and fly to Italy and fly to Japan and fly to India and fly to Africa when you can just go to Epcot down at Disney and see everything in one location? And, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But then I realized, okay, wait a minute. From a resources perspective, not everybody can go visit different places, and that's very normal. But then I thought, if you can't go to all these places, please just understand that going to Epcot is not the same as seeing the world. So, what was it in you that got you that had you? I'll use the term brave enough, and desirous enough to even take that on, because that's a daunting idea, and you did it. What made you say, not only do I want to do it, I'm doing it?
It was terrifying at moments,
I
especially
guess, yeah.
and being at that point very young, and alone. The scariest part was getting off the airplane and getting to your first hotel. And I did it because I had kind of burned out at work. I was actually traveling domestically for work. I was in one of those on Monday it's Chicago, Tuesday it's San Francisco, Wednesday it's Baltimore, type of lives, and I was just fried. And I needed a change of scenery. I needed not to be a business person all the time, and I guess that need overrode that fear, which may or may not have been smart.
Yeah, it's amazing. So on that first, round the world trip, what did that consist of? What countries?
The first place I went was to Berlin, and the wall was still up. And so I went through Checkpoint Charlie and got to visit um, East Berlin before it was liberated how many years ago. But from basically with the round the world ticket, you had to keep moving in one direction. You could move up and you could move north and south many times, and
Mm.
you had to go through hubs. It was with TWA or Pan Am, I can't remember, an airline that no longer exists. So I would almost always have to go back up into Europe. So I from Berlin I went down to Kenya, which is kind of what did it for me. Stayed there for 2 months, came back up into Europe, did a little bit of the Europe tour, spent a couple months in Greece, went on to India, went to then I think I went to Thailand after that. And in Thailand, I broke an ankle. So I immediately took the next flight to Hong Kong, where I turned back into the business traveler that I was. I had a car pick me up at the airport. I went to a Marriott and I recuperated. And this is after $2 a night hotels for 8 or 9 months. So you never leave that person behind, I guess, no matter what you do.
Well, having traveled to some far flung places, in some parts of the world, a $2 hotel is better than what the image would be that you think it would be. But then in other parts of the world, it's every bit what you would think a $2 hotel would be. So here you are, you're this a woman who's traveling on her own. She's seeing the world. You're armed with your sense of adventure and your camera and a bunch of $2 bills for hotel rooms each night. Wow. Now back in the day, well, I'm assuming. So tell me if I'm wrong, though. Were you shooting film or digital then?
I was shooting film,
Mhm.
which was logistically one of the things that I had to deal with. So I would have to find a camera store in each location, and I would take the film in and I'd get it processed, but I wouldn't have them cut the film, cut the strips. I'd just have them roll it up and put it back in the canister. And so I didn't see anything that I shot until I got back home.
Wow. Remember those
It's
days?
different than today. Yeah.
Wow. So I know that I think my first digital camera would have been in probably 2000.
I think mine was much later. I stuck with film for a while because I wasn't sure this digital thing was going to stick.
Right.
Uh, yeah, if I'd only known. And I want to say it was more like 2004, 2005, that time frame.
Yeah, I mean, early on, as you know, they were kind of sorting out the whole digital camera thing, where you had like a 1 megapixel picture, or whatever it was, but it was about the coolest thing ever that you could just make a picture and it's right there right now. I mean, I remember it was kind of mind blowing.
It is, and not only from a technology standpoint, but for your photography, it makes such a difference because you can self-correct very quickly. Whereas before, you had to wait for 36 pictures to come back from processing. And by then, you were back from wherever you were, and you had to wait for the next trip to do it right or better.
Well, yeah, you just get that immediate feedback, and not only of course the digital cameras have evolved an incredible amount, but whether you're shooting through the viewfinder or you're looking at the LCD on the back, you just I think even for someone who was very early on in photography, the ability to compose images and yes, you could be on auto, but if you were on manual mode, you could see the effect of changing your f-stop, changing your ISOs. You could literally see it in real time a lot of times. So it was, yeah, it was invaluable kind of training as you were out in the field because you only had 36 pictures at most per roll. And it was a pain to carry. And if it went through the X-ray machine, depending upon the ISO and et cetera, it could be ruined or it could be certainly damaged. So so when you were coming back from this sojourn around the world, how many rolls of film did you have that you finally made it home with? What would you even guess that was?
I have no idea. Not,
Hundreds,
not
probably.
well, no,
Okay.
because I was pretty selective, probably because I had to carry it the whole time.
Right.
But I'm going to say no more than 50.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I also was poor, so I couldn't afford a lot.
There's
So
that.
I was very careful with what I shot. As you were in those days, I mean, as you were talking about the 36 rolls, 36 photos in a roll, I used to shoot underwater, and you can burn up 36 pictures pretty quickly underwater. And so I also had to learn to be very, very careful and only take the shots that mattered rather than, just hope that something turned out if I took a lot of photos.
Sure, sure. Now, with you traveling to the places that you did, and I'm still kind of back on the early days. I would imagine that in addition to wildlife, you had every opportunity to shoot what now we call street photography and architecture and maybe detail type things, almost macro kind of stuff, even though you may not have had a macro lens on it. What did you find yourself shooting? What forms of photography along those lines were you shooting when you were in these various locations?
Well, there weren't wildlife in places like East Berlin or Bangkok.
Right, not a lot, right? On the
Yeah.
street of Berlin, right?
So it really was whatever caught my eye. So I'd kind of put it in that travel category, but probably people more than anything. And I've never felt comfortable photographing people.
Mm.
And maybe that's because a lot of countries that I go to, they don't want to be photographed in the first place. But I never had that great ability to walk up to someone and convince them that they needed me to take their picture. But I did it. They were great.
Yeah, I have found for me that when I'm traveling around the world, that the camera it's almost like a passport or a language barrier breaker. So you end up using your best effort with facial expressions, gestures. But I've had, and I'll put it again in air quotes, conversations with people without hardly ever actually speaking. It's motions, it's nodding of the head, it's showing of pictures and smiles and all that. So, and especially in countries where I'm completely unfamiliar with the language. If I've been in, say Bangladesh or India or Japan, I don't speak or understand, almost anything. Whereas if I'm in Italy or if I'm in a Spanish speaking country, I have some ability to speak it and some ability to understand it. But I've just found that the camera is sort of this great equalizer, not for everybody. Not everybody wants their picture taken, and that's okay. But when it's used in a sensitive way, I think that it can really be fantastic as a way to bring people together.
Yeah, agree. You're just a little braver than I am sometimes.
So your love of wildlife began when? Was this something as a child, or did it come to you, as you were getting a little bit, older and growing up and teens and so forth?
So I've already confessed that I was taking photographs during the film age. So we know I'm not a spring chicken. I don't know if you remember Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom.
Marlon Perkins.
Marlon Perkins.
Yeah.
I loved that show. And that did it. I wanted to be the female Marlon Perkins. And then whatever night of TV that was on, Flipper was on another night. And I wanted to do this stuff underwater. So it was really from a very young age. Marlon got in my head, and that was it.
I just remember I wanted to be Jim because Marlon would say, "Let's go to Jim in the bush," and I didn't know if he lived there. I didn't know what Jim's story was, but Jim was always who they were cutting to. but no, I loved that. And as a kid, this is a little bit removed from that, but it was the ABC Wide World of Sports, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat. So I think it's those two programs, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and then the sports. Those really resonated, and then really to go further afield, Candid Camera, but that's a whole other thing.
I was about to say, I dream of Jeannie. I just never figured out how to live in a pink bottle and get the astronaut.
Right, right. Yeah, it's kind of cramped quarters to live in, unless you're in New York City, where most of the apartments are roughly the size of a bottle. So you really started to love the animals, and I know that you have a tremendous affinity for the country of Kenya. What is it about Kenya in general that just really speaks to you? And then how does it speak to you in a way that maybe somewhat different or more so than some of the other countries in the African continent?
So I feel that that Kenya is more authentic in many ways than other countries. Um, in a country, I won't say which one, in case there are people that think it's the best place on earth. I felt everything was slick. The lodges were slick. Um, the way they organized going out with the guides was a little bit too choreographed for my taste. And so I ultimately I enjoy Kenya because it's so authentic. I became a frequent visitor to Kenya because in 2007 I joined a donor trip. I had no money, but they felt sorry for me. A donor trip to Kenya to the Conservancy of Lewa, which is in northern Kenya. And the person who led the donor trip was cousin to the owner of a contiguous um, conservancy, Barana. And as a result, she had tremendous relationships. And through her, I met these wonderful people who just very kindly welcomed me into their community and became my friends as well. And so, honestly, I've just built such a great network of friends in Kenya that it's an easy place to go to. It feels like home.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I've been fortunate to travel to a number of countries and in Africa, and I feel like, as you said, sometimes, I used the Disney analogy earlier with Epcot, but I almost feel like sometimes you're at a Disney resort that is factually based in the country that we're talking about, but sometimes it is a little too slick. It's too polished. I've stayed in canvas tents on the side of rivers in Shiitake Springs, where it's anything but glamorous, and the toilet is basically a hole that was dug, etc. But
Yes.
and that can be okay too, and there can be a middle ground and all that kind of stuff. But so as you have gone through the African continent, um, what surprised you once you got there, and whether it was the first trip or the second trip? What sort of realizations came across you that might have been different than what you would have thought before you ever went there for the first time? Any misconceptions, or just you thought, oh, it's going to be like this, but it's really more like that?
Gosh, good question. Um, I think I thought I'd be in more danger than I truly was. Uh, no matter, and I blonde haired, blue eyed female going to these countries where you clearly don't fit in. Um, you do kind of worry that you're going to stand out and that you'll be harassed. And I have been bothered at times, but for the most part, I find these countries very welcoming of tourists. They want you to experience the things that they know and love, and they'll do an awful lot not only to help you experience those, but also to protect you if you need it. So I went with more fears that were never realized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, well, two things. One directly photography related, and the other not as much. So I had no idea what type of food would be served at the camps. No, no idea. And to the point where, and this is, it's especially funny now, but I brought with me 2 boxes of granola bars. And I thought, if I have water I can drink, I can survive for, a week on granola bars, maybe. Well, I can tell you that I came back to the States with those 2 boxes of granola bars unopened, intact for the most part, maybe a little crushed. But the food was
It's
so
amazing.
incredible. And I found myself trying food that I would have never tried before. Now, some people said to me, are you eating, bush meat? Are you eating baboons? Are you eating? To which I replied, only on Tuesdays. But the answer is no. You're being fed, beef and chicken and fish and pork and vegetarian options. And if you have special needs from a dietary perspective, they can accommodate those. Obviously, you let people know in advance, and that's part of a questionnaire. So you can enjoy the food there. In fact, many people will say, I've got to be careful because I'll put weight on because the food is so plentiful and so good. So that was a surprise to me. The other thing that was a surprise, and this is just sort of being naive, the very first time I went, I had no idea what the density of wildlife would be. So
Mm-hmm.
so there I am during the migration in Tanzania in the Masai Mara, and I cannot see a single animal as far as the eye can see. Oh, and then there's a bird. Okay, there is a lizard. But I didn't know what I was expecting. And then I also expected that, animals live and die every day in Africa. So I thought, where's the bones? Like, where's an elephant bone or a zebra bone or whatever? Hardly any bones. And then as the day went on, and we would come over a ridge and I would see 600 wildebeest mixed in with zebra. And then I came to realize that, I knew this wasn't the zoo, but it is not the zoo. The animals go where the animals want to go. And there are tons of them in certain places and less of them in other places. But where they are now, in 2 hours, they won't be there. They'll be at the next place. So
It's their migration.
yeah, and so if you were advising somebody who was going to go on a trip, and whether it's in the continent of Africa or really anywhere from a wildlife standpoint, in terms of packing your patience and creating expectations, how would you advise somebody who loves animals, loves wildlife, wants to go make pictures, but how would you kind of help them manage their expectations before they leave?
Do your research. And I know that sounds trite, but I'm in the middle of it right now. I will. One of my dreams has been to go to Svalbard and shoot polar bears and walruses. And I've seen on Instagram these people with the close-up polar bears with the blood dripping from their face and all these wonderful photos. And I started watching videos. This actually happened a couple days ago. I was on YouTube and happened to notice one. These people were shooting with 1,000 millimeter lenses and they were still little dots on the surface. So my expectations for Svalbard have changed considerably in the past week because I did the research. I think you can actually ask people who have been before exactly that question. I'm only going to get to do this once in my life. It's really important to me that I make it count. What's the best bang for the buck as far as seeing animals? And even within a country, where are the spots within a country, and who are the guides that can do it? Um, it's not just showing up and hoping it all works out. It's doing your research ahead of time.
Yeah, I was talking to a gentleman who leads trips to Africa, and he mentioned he had picked up a family from the airstrip, and one of the family members said to him, "What time do the animals come out to eat?" And he looked at his watch and he said, "In about 15 minutes, so we better hurry." They eat when they can eat is really the answer. They eat whenever opportunity presents itself. Yeah, and it's funny because if you haven't done research, and if you haven't spoken with people, um, it is really such a new experience to be out in their environment. We're in their environment, whereas when you go to a zoo, they're kind of in a version of our environment.
You can't get away.
Yeah, yeah, and we're on their time, and they're going to come and go and eat and sleep. There is some regularity to it because they're animals and they do have a way that they do things. And some animals are nocturnal, and some animals are out in the daytime. But within that very wide set of parameters, they're going to do what they do when they want to do it. Um, so it's kind of interesting there. Now, you brought up as you were giving that description a question or a point that I get questioned about a lot, and the comment you made was that you may have a polar bear and there's some blood on its whiskers or paws, etc. The question I get, and it's not specific to one type of animal, it's more about predators. Is am I going to see animals eating another animal and this kind of stuff? And because everybody has their perspective on that and tolerances for that. And so, one friend of mine who's quite an accomplished photographer, his comment was, if you see that and you choose to make a picture of it, it's not going to go anywhere. You're not going to put that on your wall. You're not going to frame it. People aren't going to buy it. You're probably not going to post it if that's what you want. So get your picture, but don't spend too long on it because it's interesting. It's nature, but at some point it's just sort of like gratuitous, and there's other pictures to make out there. But what would be your suggestions for people who have a little, interest, but also maybe apprehension about what they may see when they're out in the wild in general?
So my biggest interest is in animal behavior. And when it comes to a kill, the most fascinating experience I had was in the Mara. We came on, I think it was a buffalo. It's either a buffalo or a wildebeest during the migration that had been killed by lions. And we sat for a very long time at the carcass. And it was fascinating because there was an order that evolved at that carcass. And the lions would be there, then the hyenas would come and chase them off. And then the jackals were always kind of nipping at everybody's heels. And then when the carrion birds came in, you saw that not only were there carrion birds that cleaned up the remains, but within that group of birds, they were interested in different pieces and parts. And they took turns and they kind of cycled through like everything else did. So your point earlier that you don't see bones, you don't see carcasses, it's because nature has this wonderful system that starts with the big predators and ends with the carrion birds and probably even the smaller of animals at the end that cleans all that stuff up. And if you're interested in understanding how nature works, sitting at a site like that can be absolutely fascinating. But again, it becomes very important to have the right guide with you so he can point these things out, because sometimes you don't notice them unless somebody says, hey, did you notice that the marabou storks, and this is going to be gross, only like the eyeballs? And then you start looking, and sure enough, there are marabou storks carrying eyeballs around everywhere. So it's if you accept that animals have to eat and they have to eat each other, and the moment of kill is hard no matter how many times you've seen it. It's just heart-wrenching. And because it's usually a smaller animal, it's usually a baby that's caught. But if you can get past that, it can be absolutely fascinating from a behavior and nature standpoint.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, it's interesting that, most people, I think, would not realize that within the bird world that, and I didn't realize this until a number of years ago, but there are birds that are often referred to as like the rippers and then kind of the strippers. So certain birds cannot really get inside of the animal to eat. So you have others that have very sharp beaks, and they kind of create an opening, and then everybody can eat. And so once the animal, there's not a whole lot left, you ultimately get down to the hyena, and the hyena will come, and the hyena are so strong that they can actually crunch up and eat bone. And so that's where, as you referenced, that's where you're not going to find a whole lot of bones because literally nothing goes to waste. So, that's how the survival of all the animals happens. And, as many times as people use that expression, the circle of life, you're seeing the circle of life in real time, and it's pretty dramatic. So, if looked at from that perspective, you realize that if we were there to see it or not, these things are going to occur every day because they have to just to survive. And I think, it can be difficult, as you said, but that's how you kind of, I don't know if it's rationalized, but that's how you realize, yeah, this is life. This is part of what I came to see.
Yeah, and people go for different reasons. You see people on safari that are there just for a great family adventure, and they
Mhm.
really enjoy the meals at night and sitting around the fireplace. And it's a bonus that they get to see pretty things, and that's okay. So I think part of the question you talked about if somebody's apprehensive, or just trying to understand what they're going to see and how they're going to react to it. Really spend some time thinking about why you're going and what you're interested in. And it's okay not to be interested in that. And it's okay to say, I really don't want to see this. Please move the vehicle. Um, but if you do have a deep want to have a deep understanding of nature, want to understand how things work, then that can be a pretty informative event.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. So when you're out there, what sort of setup do you bring from a gear perspective, with lenses to accommodate what you're there to shoot, and does it vary based upon what part of Africa, or if there's specific animals within a geography? What do you bring out into the field?
Not as much as I want to, because you're generally leaving the main city and going on a bush plane that severely restricts the weight you can carry. I always carry two bodies for two reasons. One, if one fails, you've got a backup. But second, a lot of the places I go are very dusty and dirty, and I don't want to be changing lenses in the field. So I can have two different sets of focal lengths with me that will accommodate most situations. I would love to have a great long prime lens. I do have one, um, but spending $18,000 on a lens is just not something that even if I had it, I think I could stomach doing. So I take zoom lenses, and the quality of the glass with zoom has improved so significantly that it works. So I'm looking at my cameras right now. When I was on DSLRs, I had a 200 to 500 that was my workhorse. I generally take a 70 to 200 or 210, whatever they sort out to be. Um, and then for fun, I always take a fisheye because you never know what you're going to get. Now that I'm on mirrorless, I just got a 100 to 400 that I'm loving, and I've got a converter for that. I did the 2x. I think I'm going to get a 1.4 instead. And then some shorter lenses, but kind of the same approach. I try to take the full range, keep them on two different cameras, so I'm ready for that lion that all of a sudden approaches the vehicle. The first shot may have been at 400 millimeters, and all of a sudden he's at 20.
Yeah, yeah, and it's always great to have the ability to switch from one to the other pretty quickly, and then once in a great while, if you have one that malfunctions, you really need to have two, so you're not with half of your trip or even the beginning of your trip, and you've got all these great lenses, but your camera's not working.
Yeah, yeah. I did a trip recently. I can't even remember which it was that I only took the 500 prime. And it was interesting. I enjoyed it, but I missed a few shots.
Yeah. Well, sometimes putting limitations on yourself does require that you think differently. I know, I do a lot of street photography, and if I go out on the street with a 28 or a 35 and that's all that I have, then you start to have to see in that way, and kind of train your brain. And that way, when you have multiple lenses, you kind of have an idea of what those frame lines are going to look like in that composition, which then you can choose. Do I go with a
Yeah.
50, a 75, a 28, a 35, because you're already thinking in that mode. And that's one of the things that I like so much about photography, is that you never know it all. You're always learning. what you've been doing this for a while. What gets you just super excited to pack up the car, either to go somewhere that you can drive, or get on the plane because you're going to somewhere. What is it about photography that just kind of gets you really enthused and excited to get out the door, even if you're leaving home at 3 in the morning to get a flight or whatever else that it is?
Well, I've learned it's not birds. Not a bird photographer. I went to Costa Rica recently, and I am definitely not interested in birds. So if you aren't interested in Costa Rica, you're not interested anywhere. Um, Sometimes it's just the peace and quiet. When I have a camera to my eye, everything else goes away. And of course, if I'm watching something that I'm really interested in, I focus even more. And I've always lived a pretty busy life that I'm multitasking constantly. And the the luxury of only being able to focus on one thing at a time is pretty valuable to me. Of course, I always get excited if I'm going to see something new. If it's a time of year that animals are doing something interesting, so like you say, the migration or calving season. Um, I'm heading to North Carolina. There's a place I like to photograph bears in North Carolina in July, and there are almost always mamas with babies by their side, and that's exciting. So it really is that ability to very selfishly focus only on me and what I'm doing, and do it around things that I love.
I'm a very bad guitar player, but what it does when I'm trying to figure out why I can't possibly stretch my fingers to play a particular chord, but it requires that you focus on that to the exclusion of whatever else is in your head. Based on our conversation, photography I find to be the same. Is It's just really hard to have other thoughts swimming through your head if you're focusing on, is that bear going to jump up on the log, or, whatever else it is. So I do feel it's like it's such a mental break.
It is.
And
It
it's
is.
like a productive mental break because you get the break, but then you also get to create photos. So it's not just in the moment when you're out doing that, but then you can enjoy the fruits of that time that you spent with that focus.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I love processing photos because I feel that that's really my opportunity to be truly creative. And I do not Photoshop. I don't move things around. But taking and raw files are pretty flat and not attractive, no matter how great the image is.
Mhm.
But to get those into Lightroom and to turn it into something that I'm proud to show people, I enjoy that.
So and that raises a good point. So when you get back from a shoot, kind of maybe if you can walk people listening through your process, from, you don't want to lose these pictures. So they're going to get uploaded somewhere, maybe backed up somewhere. You're going to pick out some pictures, maybe kind of walk, the listeners through, on the typical trip, you have X number of pictures. What does that look like for you when you get back home?
Yeah, well, I always take a laptop with me and lots of memory cards and three SSD drives. I am the queen of belts and suspenders. So every night I download all of my photos onto those three different SSD drives. And I also do a quick scan through, and sometimes I get caught on one and decide to process it all the way through. Um, but I look for that opportunity to self correct if I'm doing something stupid during the day. I have a tendency to lean to my left when I photograph, so all my pictures are tipped. So it gives me an opportunity to remind myself to do that. Or if I'm finding I'm using a new lens and I haven't quite figured out the focus. Those drives come home with me, as do all the cards, in different places. They're scattered all around, one of which is on my body, in case everything gets lost. And then I have not found a cloud-based service that I like. We can talk separately if you've got one, because I'm just not there. I'm being cheap and avoiding the RAID system, but I have multiple large hard drives that I then move all the files to, which I haven't done for Costa Rica yet because it was a bunch of birds, and who cares? No, that's terrible. um, and then I tend to go through in Lightroom, and there's a star rating system you can give, and the first run through is if there's something I want to look at again, I give it a 1. Just kind of sorts out all the bad ones. I tend to I tend not to go back and delete the really bad ones, more out of laziness than anything else, and the fact that storage is cheap. And then I take all those ones and I sort them. And if I like them, I make it a three. And basically, I cycle up until I have my short list of fives, which are the ones that I really want to take forward.
So let's take, one of those 5-star ones that you want to work on, you want to process. You open that up. What are the things that you find that you're typically making adjustments to when you already know you like the image, you like the composition, you like it, but you just kind of want to work with it a little bit? What are those few steps that you almost always do on every image just to get it exactly the way you want?
Yeah. Well, I straighten the horizon because I tip. That's the first thing. Um, I People might argue with this, but I actually go to the Lightroom, and I can't even remember because I do it so automatically. There's an auto adjust for all the things in your basic panel,
Mhm.
and I hit that just to see what it looks like. And then that becomes a starting point, and I adjust downward from there. I almost always bring up the shadows, always add more black. Um, because I'm with animals and they have fur and rough skin, texture is important to me. Might give it a little contrast, but my adjustments are pretty minor at that point.
Mhm.
Uh, I do try to get it right in camera. If I'm spending a lot of time on an image, I have to remind myself that it probably wasn't that good in the first place, and maybe you should move on.
There's so many people nowadays who their photos live really only on social media, which kind of ties into the concept of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So, with social media having grown to what it has grown to, how do you, I mean, we all like when people like our work. It's natural, and people kind of see your vision and they go, wow, that's really great the way you did this, that, and the other, and it feels good and it makes sense. But how do you kind of manage the duality of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation or feedback? And would you have any suggestions or ideas for people who take pictures and they're posting them online to be happy with the images you're making? How do you balance that?
Sometimes I have images that only I like, and I like them because they remind me of an experience. And I now have something to keep forever that documents that experience. And social media is a necessary evil, and I'm not very good at it. I don't have thousands of followers. I have my staple of the people that generally follow me, and it does feel it's so nice when somebody likes your picture. That's just it's heartwarming. Um, I I tell people the second worst thing that can happen to a photographer is if somebody comments, "Oh my God, you should be in National Geographic." And the first worst thing that can happen to a photographer is if they believe it, um, because that you stop learning. You stop learning, you stop growing when you think you're just the best out there. If you were going to be a National Geographic, they would have found you already. So that's not the case. So take those comments from social media, and your friends and your family, especially, with a grain of salt. They don't know what they're talking about. Um, but everybody tries to find purpose in what they do. I can't, just because I'm that type of person, do something without some other purpose. And my goal with nature photography is to help people appreciate the natural world and understand the natural world, because I feel that people with an appreciation for it will grow to love it, and they will protect. There's that old saying that everybody's quoted as saying, people will protect what they know and love. And that is my goal, to make sure people are aware of what's out there and how we as humans can disrupt what's happening, um, and why we shouldn't and what we should do about it. So the social media comments that I appreciate the most are the ones that I've gotten this from a couple people, and this is just really my favorite, is, "We wait for your photos at my house, and my kids and I sit down and talk about them." And I think, well, maybe I'm their Marlon Perkins, maybe I'm helping in some way. These kids grow an appreciation that will stick with them for life. I also try to publish in magazines, and a lot of times it's online magazines, with articles anytime somebody will accept it. And I think I have a good story to tell, because you've got people then not just looking at the picture, but getting the context behind it and understanding some of the messages that you're trying to portray, and hope they'll understand about what's going on out there.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, as especially kids are looking at the pictures and they're starting to learn from them and grow their appreciation for wildlife. I was just the other day up in Philadelphia, and I decided I wanted to go to the Philadelphia Zoo, which is the oldest zoo in America, and it's extensive and has some really sizable enclosures for animals. So there's, if the tigers and some of the bears, they really have a pretty good environment there, while still in a zoo. But I'm kind of two minds about a zoo. Is it an animal in a jail? I mean, we could have that debate or have that conversation. But like the kids who are looking at your work and learning about it and talking to their parents, you're not going to see a crocodile walking down the street. So if you can see, and if you do, walk the other way, but if you can see it in a zoo and it sparks interest to where you realize that they don't live naturally in a zoo, and it sparks the interest and the research and maybe the exploration. So maybe that, in a good zoo environment, maybe that's not, a bad situation. But yeah, I think that the photography work that you're doing, not only is it beautiful work, but I do think that it comes across your enjoyment of what you're doing. When I've seen your work, do you have a favorite animal?
Yes, if you've looked at my Instagram, it's an elephant. I'm completely obsessed with elephants. Just I could spend every day with elephants and be perfectly happy. Nothing better than snuggling a baby elephant, which you don't get many opportunities to do. But I, beyond the fact that they're beautiful and endangered, and all those things that you want to spend time protecting, they have incredible social structures. And the more you learn about them, the more you are amazed at the things they know and do deliberately. They're not just wandering around eating grass. They actually have a purpose when they're out there. And they're fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. And the thing that amazes me is that, at the end of their trunks, they have, it almost looks like two fingers that they can use to pick up the smallest seed pods, and so delicately. It's incredible. I mean, if they had the inclination, you think that they could hold sushi chopsticks and eat sushi with them, because it's really remarkable, that and how quiet they can be when they want to
Up
be.
on you. Yes.
Yeah,
All of a sudden there's an elephant there. There
yeah,
was.
I've had that experience on more than a few occasions where there's just this big gray mass almost next to me, and I realize, wait a minute, that mass has a huge orange eye and eyelashes, and
Yeah.
I'm literally 3 feet from a massive, actually way too close, but yeah. Now elephants are amazing. They're just amazing, and they really do, as you say, they have very well established family structures, and clearly, in their own way, they mourn the loss of family members, and it's really something. So as you've evolved your photography, either early on or even in present day, are there any photographers that you feel you've learned from, either directly or through their work, or they've inspired you? Who would those be?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many fabulous photographers out there. And I do spend a lot of time looking at other people's work to learn, because there's always somebody that's going to do it better. One of my main goals is storytelling. And so my ultimate goal is for someone to look at a photograph of mine and be able to understand the full story. And I don't think I'll ever get there. But the person I think that's closest to it is a woman named Deanne Fitzmaurice, who is in San Francisco. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and her photographs are so multi-layered that you start in one corner and you see one thing, and then all of a sudden you go, wait a minute, look at that over there. And you can spend ages wandering through her photograph and understanding the scene. I had the opportunity to meet with her and shoot with her for a while, and she's, it's nice is she's very low key and unassuming, and she's able to do what she does because people trust her, and then she just kind of melts into the background, and they don't even notice she's there. So I love Deanne's work. There's another woman named Morgan Moheim, who is a conservation photographer who is the most creative person I've ever met. And she is very much a storyteller. And she thinks really hard about and she creates scenes many times, but they're not artificially created. They're artificially created, but there's not an artificial sense that this is real. So she was documenting very dangerously marijuana growers in California somewhere, and the absolute decimation of the environment around these marijuana plots. And she went to an old plot that had been, I guess they pull everything up and left, and she put tea candles in each single one of the holes and then photographed that. And it was just such a way to demonstrate what damage had been done to that environment, and then she could talk about it further. From a pure talent perspective, I think Keith Ledzinski is one of the most talented photographers out there. He can shoot anything, and it's incredible. So I could go on and on because there are so many photographers I admire and aspire to do just a tiny bit of what they do.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Deanne. So she is going to be a guest on the podcast.
Oh, good. She's
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah. So I'm thrilled that she will be, and thrilled that she's someone whose work you enjoy and who you've enjoyed being out in the field with. That's terrific. So,
Great.
from your earlier days out in the field with wildlife photography, are there any lessons that you learned, over time or pretty quickly that kind of got you up the curve? Kind of like, hey, if I'm going to be out here shooting, I need to know this, or I need to work on that. Any of those kind of lessons you learn that we can pass on to listeners and help them get up the curve faster if they choose to get out in the field and do this?
Yeah, and probably two things. One is spray and pray is not a tactic. Don't just sit there with the trigger finger down. We're all guilty of it. You get excited and you think something's going to happen and you're afraid to let go because you're going to miss something. But I found when I go back and look at my photographs after the fact, the first picture in that string of spray and praise is always the best, because that's the time I stopped and thought about what I was trying to do, what I wanted to accomplish, and intentionally push the trigger when it was time. So I will have 50 images that all look alike, and I can guarantee you number one is going to be the best. So slow down, stop just taking pictures. I've got, and cameras make it so easy nowadays. We've got these things that shoot how many frames a second, and you just barely touch them and you got 30 pictures. I try to shoot in short bursts, 3 pics at a time, and then stop and step back. And that's really improved my photography. I think the other thing is photography has been done disservice by the people that said, get in tight and close. That's the way you'll have a fantastic picture. All that proves is that you've got a good long lens and that you can focus. I really believe my photography has improved, and maybe people will argue that this is not the case, when I've taken more of an environmental approach to it, and I've tried to show the animal, or if there's a person, in context with their surroundings and as a part of a bigger I keep saying environment, but a bigger environment, that they're not just a face that you could get close to, but there's something going on there, and they're a living being doing something that's interesting to you. Those are probably the two things.
Yeah, and I think with you using in a lot of instances a long zoom, the nice thing is you can start off with that sort of environmental portrait, and then you can move in with the zoom a little closer, and then eventually you can fill the frame with the face or with just the body. But that one lens gives you the ability, maybe it's a 200 to 500 or 100 to 400, but the reasonable distances that you would be from the animals, you can certainly show this is the environment that they're in, and zoom and get these other images before a whole lot changes. So you can do that. And yeah, I agree. We see so many of these shots, whether it's a lion or whatever it is, just sort of laying there. And you don't know, what is it laying around? Is it laying at the foot of a lake? Is it laying under a big tree? Is it laying with other members of the pride? And so, yeah, I agree. But it is interesting to see as the days go on when you're out in the field, especially if it's your first time. People are shooting, 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 shooting. You're going through your memory card in the first 2 hours.
Yeah.
So, and
Okay.
nowadays,
You're excited. It's good.
yeah, 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 and it's good. I'm sure you've heard people say this, but sometimes it's good just to take the camera down from your face
Very much.
and look with your eyes and not just through the camera, because there might be something going on left or right of center that's more interesting than that hyena that's just sort of down in the grass, especially if there is a group of impala that don't know that the hyena is there, and you can kind of see a whole scene developing. And that's actually, that's probably a good thing for us to talk about. So generally, I am one of the least patient people you'd ever meet, but from the many years of shooting wildlife and sports, I have come to realize that sometimes you have to sit by a wild dog den for 2.5 hours because sunset will come and they will become active. So, what can you say to the idea of the importance of patience, specifically in wildlife photography?
Yeah. Again, I give so much credit to my guides. Trust your guide. They know if they tell you to sit and wait, sit and wait. Just by driving your vehicle up to that wild dog den, which, by the way, I still haven't seen a wild dog. It's on my list. You've created an artificial environment, and those animals are going to behave differently because you brought that
Mhm.
car close to them. If you sit back and wait quietly, the chatter in safari vehicles drives me nuts. Be quiet, stop talking, and just let them get comfortable with you. Emerge from wherever they're hiding or let the tension drop. They're going to do a lot more interesting things. It's not going to be just, as you say, the lion lying there and not knowing what it is. When he gets comfortable, he's going to yawn, he's going to stretch, he's going to get up, he's going to groom himself. His friend's going to groom him, and then he's going to start to wander. And he's going to start to hunt. That wouldn't happen first if you didn't wait, but second, if you just kind of were there making noise, being an annoyance to him. So you're going to get a lot more interesting photographs, and you're going to see a lot more interesting things if you just stop and let things settle, and wait.
And along those lines, whether it is a wild dog or, something like a leopard or a cheetah, how would you describe to a person who hasn't seen it kind of what that process looks like visually from when a lion or any of these predators, when they sort of sit up and they start smelling the air, and maybe the tail starts to wag or move a little differently than before, and then they may get up on all fours, and then they start looking around. Can you kind of describe what that process kind of looks like as a photographer to witness as it leads towards a hunt?
I think as a photographer, you want to be anticipatory. So you want to know what's going to happen so you can be there when it happens. Um, with a leopard, for example, um, if you if you see them, this is simplistic, everybody's going to know this, but if you see them holding a carcass at the bottom of the tree, at some point they're going to go up the tree, and hang it up there so nobody can get it. Start looking at which branches would be the most likely, which cruxes in the branches would hold an impala. um, Start trying to position yourself so there isn't a bush in front of you when that happens. It's really about trying to anticipate where that animal is going to be or what they're going to be in the future, and making sure you are prepared to take the best shot possible. Again, guides, tremendous for that. They can many times tell you, sit still, it's going to go there. And sure enough, there it goes. But as you do it more, you start to understand those things yourself. A good example of that is giraffes drinking. When giraffes drink, they splay their legs, which is hilarious because their legs are so long and they're so awkward. And they put their heads down and they drink. And at the end of that, they're going to lift their heads and then they're going to flip their nose. And there's going to be this fabulous curve of water spray that comes out of their nose. And they're just the most fun pictures. That's one of those where anticipate what's going to happen, get ready and wait for it because it will come along and you'll have a picture you'll treasure.
Yeah, and there's really no substitute for time in the field to be able to have opportunities to make those pictures. And as much time as the guides spend in there, I'm always amazed how, whether the guide is guiding from the driver's seat or you may have a guide who's sitting on a seat that's kind of out front of the vehicle, but the way that the guides can read the tracks, and they know if that track is an hour ago or last night or a few days ago by how soft or hard the ridges are in the track of the footprint. And which direction it's going and how many, and is it male or is it female? I mean, it's kind of remarkable. And I feel like, when you're out there, whether it's your first time or your 10th time, it's almost like there's a certain amount of lore that goes along with it. It's kind of like very tribal in a way, as far as how, these men and women who are the trackers, how they key in on things. And one thing that amazes me is, we can be in a vehicle, not even going fast necessarily, and a few of us will have binoculars, and the driver will say leopard, and you say what leopard, what leopard, and you can't even hardly see it with your binoculars, but he has seen a shape like a football field away, a tail barely visible at the bottom of a cluster of leaves. And he sees it, and you get close enough to even see it in your binoculars. And sure enough, there it is. I mean, what's that like when that happens? I mean, to me, it's just unbelievable.
You feel like an idiot, and you try so hard. You're like, there's a leopard. Where? I don't see a leopard. It's there. Can't you see it? No, I don't see it. And it's by the bush. Well, there are 12 bushes out there. Well, it's by the green bush. Well, there are 8 green bushes. It's you feel so stupid, but so grateful that they have found it. And you mentioned sitting and waiting, and them knowing what the prints look like. The ones that get me are I'm in a fabulous sighting, I'm taking shots, and all of a sudden they start the car and drive off. What are you doing? This is wonderful. And they drive off and put you in a position where whatever you were looking at over there all of a sudden moves to this new spot, and it's even better than it was before. They grew up here. They in the Maasai send the little boys out to tend the cows at 5. So since being a 5-year-old, they've been on the lookout for wild animals and trying to understand them, to some degree from a survival standpoint. But those that fall in love with it, are looking for other reasons and then share that with us.
Yeah, when I was in the Sabi Sands area, we came across a cheetah that had been kind of pushed by some lions, and that cheetah wanted nothing to do with the lions. So it didn't run at full speed, but it kind of trotted away a good distance, and then we found it, and it was just laying out in the open, panting because it had been trotting for quite a while. And we waited there for about an hour and a half. And every time we thought, we're going to leave, we're going to leave, we're going to leave. Is it going to see something? Is it going to have a hunt, et cetera? And then the guide said the sun is starting to go down, which means that the cheetah will feel more comfortable moving around. And you see that water way over there, 200 yards over there. He said, why don't we go over there? Because that cheetah is going to want some water, because the cheetah is going to want to hunt at sunset. So we can get that picture if we get over there. We go over to the water hole in the position that the guide felt is in front of, well in front of where the cheetah would be. Guess what happens? Sure enough, cheetah up. Cheetah comes over. Cheetah leans over, curls its tail in a half circle, starts drinking, hears some kind of animal sound in the distance, and while it's hunched over, lifts its head, its eyes, which are somewhat orange or illuminated by the setting sun, that and we're right there to make that picture. And I just thought that's about the most insane thing I've ever heard. I was actually in Alaska with a dear friend, Art Wolf, and Art and I are walking through the rivers, and there are these grizzlies that are eating the salmon in the river. And Art says to me, he says, look, come on over here, come on over here. He says, you see that riverbank over there? After the salmon is eaten by the bear, when he's done with it, that bear's going to turn around. He's going to walk up on top of the riverbank and wait for more salmon to come downstream, because he said that's where that bear would have caught the salmon that he's currently eating. He's going to go back up and do it again. And I'll be damned if that bear did not go up and do the same thing. And Art just looked at me and said, I know that bear. And it was just so surreal, because it's like the saying, like, if you know, then you know. And people who are living in these environments, they know the behavior, and there's no substitute for that.
Do you ever go on a trip that you don't learn something new?
Oh,
I don't think I have.
I mean, constantly. It's funny. The older I get, the more I realize how little I know. And that's about everything. That's not just about photography. And whatever I do know, after a few months, I forget it anyway. So I get to learn it again. Well, Michelle, I appreciate you being so generous with your time and being our guest. I know that listeners are going to want to be able to take a look at your work. So where is the best place or places for them to be able to take a look and see your work kind of historically, and then what you're doing, in the present?
I'm probably most consistent updating Instagram. And I've got a website that needs some attention, but there's some things on there. It's Michelle Guillermin Photography. I have a weird name. It's all smushed together, and my last name is Guillermin, which nobody gets. But yeah, that's probably the best place, and I promise to get better about some of those other places.
And you have a big exposition coming up on all of your bird work from Costa Rica.
Yes, I'll send you an invitation.
Yes, of course, of course. Well, again, I appreciate you taking so much time with us. And for everybody listening, I want to remind you that you can see what I have going on. You can go to mitchstringerimages.com. I'm also Mitch Stringer Images on Instagram. That's where you get kind of the latest and greatest of what I'm up to. Feel free to DM or email me. I'm very good at getting back to people. I know recently I've had a number of people reach out for gear questions, people who are looking to upgrade, people who are preparing for different trips. And my advice is always, whatever you want to get, go ahead and get what you choose to, but use it multiple times before you take it in the field for the first time, because you want to make sure you know what you're doing. So until next time, I wish everybody great light, great shooting. We'll see you soon.